Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. We've had a half day, and I know it's sometimes like drinking out of the fire hose. There's a lot of content that we've already covered, and accessibility 101. It seems like we've already gotten sort of immersed in accessibility. Maybe we're beyond 101, and maybe there are some of you have not been here for some of the earlier stuff this morning. So I want to talk kind of generally, but lead us into some deeper conversations about technology accessibility, in particular web accessibility that we're going to be talking about today and tomorrow. Document accessibility will be covered tomorrow, as well as some additional topics. Um, but want to just sort of lay the foundation and make sure that we all have that foundation on which to build. Um, and some of this is going to be reviewed because we have already talked about it a little bit today, but I think that will be good for everyone just to kind of reinforce some of the concepts that we're talking about. So, first of all, what we are talking about is access to digital information. So you've got websites, you've got digital resources, products, services, things that people need to engage with that are out there on the internet somewhere, and the user needs to engage with them somehow. And so the traditional model by which that has happened is a keyboard for input, and a mouse actually came a little bit later, but it too has been part of the traditional model for a long time. Keyboard and mouse for input, and a monitor for output. So you type something or you click something, and you then get information back via a display. So that's how it's worked for quite a while for most people. There have always been some who interacted differently, but the number who are interacting differently is rapidly evolving. And so this, what I have on the screen now is a keyboard, a mouse, and a monitor. And it's a very old school model. This is not how we access digital information anymore for the most part. It still is in use, but it's in use less and less frequently because we have mobile devices. We get people on their phones, and I know on a college campus, when prior to the pandemic anyway, we had students wandering around campus. Invariably, you'd look around and you'd see the crowds of students walking between classes, and they would have their phone out, looking at their phone, accessing digital information through their much smaller mobile device. And even within phones, you've got iPhones, you've got Androids, you've got Microsoft devices, and the different shapes, sizes, version numbers, different platforms, all of those variables have an impact on what the user experiences. And so what you are experiencing is probably very different from what somebody else is experiencing when you're accessing the same digital resource and trying to perform the same function over the internet. You also have tablets, and again, variety of platforms, variety of shapes, sizes, versions, and so forth. And again, whatever device a person has is going to have a huge impact on the overall user experience. In addition to that, you've got people who are not accessing content visually, they're accessing content audibly. So this has always been the way that somebody who can't see is accessing. One way that people who can't see is accessing information, listening to it through a speech synthesizer. So screen readers have actually existed long before Windows. There were many competitors in the old DOS days of screen readers. I know Dan and I were around, Hottie too, I think, in those days prior to Windows. And then Windows kind of threw a curveball and made it much more challenging to access information on a computer using the screen reader. But the screen readers evolved to adapt to that new environment. But nevertheless, for a long time, people have been accessing information audibly, not just visually. And nowadays, more and more people are doing that because people, even with eyesight, need an eyes-free experience sometimes, where you're listening to content because your eyes are busy doing something else. In addition to that, you have speech input. That too has traditionally been the domain of people who were not physically able to use a keyboard or a mouse. They could dictate documents using speech input, programs such as Dragon Dictate or Dragon Naturally Speaking, and could also control their computer with voice commands. And that too still is something that some individuals with disabilities do, but also is a larger interface, gaining in popularity as people need a hands-free interface, able to control their devices without necessarily using a mouse or a keyboard or even touching the screen. Sometimes you need to interact by voice, and sometimes you need to listen to content. So a wide variety of ways that people interact with technology. Also, people interact with touch. So this has not expanded to the general population, but we have here a refreshable Braille device. And so if some people who are not able to see listen to content audibly, others receive it through touch. And this particular device has a row of dots that refreshes. That's why it's called a refreshable Braille device. They can explore the content that is presented, and the row of dots changes as they explore. So they're essentially reading up and down and exploring and sort of interacting in the same way that they might interact with an audible interface, audible output, but it's a tactile interface, tactile output. And this particular device also has Braille keys for input too. So the same device can be used for both input and output. So I ran out of slide space. Otherwise, I could add many more devices. There are literally hundreds of assistive technologies that people use to interact with digital information. And it's a rich, diverse landscape. And within every device, there are lots and lots of customization settings, different ways that people can configure their device so they get a different experience. So in a nutshell, this is what digital accessibility is all about, just respecting that everybody interacts in different ways with technology. They perceive information differently. Every single one of us probably has some unique characteristic, either in the device we're using or the assistive technology we may be using, or the configuration, the font size, the brightness of our monitor. All of these things contribute to our having different experiences. And so accessibility is developing something that works across all these devices, configurations, and modalities that people use to access that information. So then when we talk about technology accessibility, we then talk about different technologies such as websites, and we consider that rich, diverse landscape, that full spectrum of users using a variety of different ways of interacting. And now here we have a website, and what's the experience like for somebody who is accessing it without a mouse, for example, just using the keyboard? And we've got here seattle.gov. We will look a little bit at that. We've got another couple of sites sort of queued up that we're going to look at in our web accessibility sessions. But when I look at any website, as I'm evaluating a website for accessibility, one of the first things I'll do is take the no mouse challenge. I will try to access things with a mouse or without a mouse. Just use the tab key to tab through and try to access everything. Make sure that I can always tell where I am. It's a key piece of the puzzle. And then when I land on something, I should be able to use that thing, whatever it may be. So if I'm a mouse user, then I may hover over a few things initially just to see kind of how they respond to mouse behaviors. And then I want to try and replicate that with the keyboard. So I see a couple of things on Seattle.gov, just glancing at it, that make me think this probably has some rich, dynamic, interactive function. So in the top right corner, I see a search button. There's no field there for me to type in a search term. And so I assume that that button probably triggers, exposes a search field. It probably pops up maybe in a modal dialog, or maybe it just appears somewhere in that, that blue bar at the top. Um, but probably if I tab to that search field and I press enter, then I would hope that I would then have a search field and my focus would be placed in that search field. And then I could type, a search term and press enter and do everything with the keyboard that I could do with the mouse. The same thing is true with the menu button next to that. Now that in of itself doesn't do anything. And we look at that, we don't get any benefit from it. But we know if we're an eyesight user who uses a mouse, then we can probably click on that and probably a menu pops up. And then we have access to links to various resources at Seattle.gov. And so the hope is if somebody tabs to that and presses enter or maybe space, then the menu will pop up. They'll be in that menu. They'll be able to navigate through the menu using the tab key or maybe the up down arrow, and press enter or space to select an item in the menu. Or if we decide we don't want any of those options, press escape. That closes the menu, that places us back on the button where we start. So these are the things, we look for just in terms of keyboard accessibility. Also, as I look at a website, I see sort of some structure here. There's a lot of content on this site, but I see some headings that sort of jump out. I see manage your utility account as that's large text. So that seems to be sort of standing out as a prominent heading. Elected officials is certainly a heading, and that you've got Jenny Durkin, you've got Pete Holmes, you've got various other things that are sort of sub items underneath that heading of elected officials. So I see that visually, and I recognize that because the text is larger, the text is bolder, but that needs to be accessible it needs to be tagged in a way that a screen reader user understands what the heading structure is, and they can very easily jump to elected officials because it's a prominent heading on the page. So as I'm evaluating web accessibility, there are lots of tools that we can use to check and see if the headings actually are headings at the appropriate levels, and check with the keyboard and so on and so forth. We can, when we get into the web accessibility sessions today, starting right after this session, we'll explore in more depth what sort of tools are out there and what we can learn about a website as we explore its accessibility. So, but a website is just one technology that we're talking about. Another is an accessible document. Digital documents have a lot of the same issues that websites have, and it kind of comes down to the same main overarching issue, which is structure. What we have here on the screen is an Introduction to Physics course syllabus, and it has all the things that you'd expect to find in a course syllabus. It's got a list of course objectives. It's got all the reading assignments broken down by week. It's got information about how your grade is determined. And all that information is kind of lost because of the way this is presented, that there is no structure here. So if I were to ask you, how many course objectives are there? That ends up being a really difficult question to answer because you sort of have to read through all this text and maybe you find the phrase course objectives, and then you can read from there and kind of figure out, okay, this must be one objective, and then there's another one after that, so that must be the second, and then you keep reading until you get what seems like content that is not a course objective, so maybe you've changed topics, and trying to parse all this and figure out what's what becomes extremely burdensome. And this is only the syllabus. This is a physics course, so it's going to be really hard. And if the syllabus, which is just an outline of the course, if it's this hard to read, then imagine how difficult the rest of the course is going to be. And imagine if you're trying to access a service through a city or a county website, and this is the experience you get. That is really daunting for a user to have to figure this out. So to make it easier for sighted users, we add structure. Exact same document, but now it has structure. It has visible structure. We know that if we're sighted, that there is an Introduction to Physics course syllabus main heading. I know that because it's big, bold, and it's centered, whereas the other big, bold text is not centered. And there are four of those items: textbook, course objectives, class schedule, and grades. Those are all big and bold as well, but they're left justified. And they're a little bit smaller than the main heading. And so I assume those are secondary headings. Those are sort of heading level 2. And each one of those is above a section of the page. And so I can really make a lot of sense out of this very quickly. And in answer to that question, how many course objectives are there? There are 3. I know this within 1 second because I see the course objectives heading, and underneath that there's a list, and each one of those list items has a bullet. And so just at a glance, I see that there are 3 headings. There are tables on this page that have column headers, and that allows me to very easily navigate the columns because I know which column I'm in at any given moment. All of this is communicated visually, but a key to accessibility, both for websites and for digital documents, is that it needs to be communicated behind the scenes as well through the underlying tag structure of the digital resource. So if it's the web page, you've got HTML behind the scenes. And within the HTML markup language, you have H1, H2, and so forth. TH for table headers, column headers, LI for list items, and so forth. The markup language includes what are called semantic elements, elements that specifically define what an element is. So this is a heading level 1. This is a heading level 2. This is a list. This is a table. This is a table header, column header within that table. So that's all communicated by the HTML. And as Gaby is going to talk about in her 2 sessions tomorrow on document accessibility, you have the same underlying tag structure in PDF and in Word documents. And so it's important, regardless of what sort of document platform you're using or format, that you have headings marked up as headings, lists as lists, table headers as table headers, and so forth. So a lot of similarities between web accessibility and document accessibility. One big difference, though, is that websites do have these interactive components, like the search button and the menu button, whereas digital documents tend to be more static, what web pages used to be, although that's evolving as well. Video presents accessibility issues as well. A video needs to be captioned. And so if somebody's not able to hear the audio, they need that audio content presented through text. And if a person is unable to see the video, then they need the visual content. And that may be communicated sufficiently through the audio. Here's an example of a University of Washington video. It was a very popular video, as we're seeing it here, 39,000 views, and that was a long time ago. I think it's far more than that now. But this was scientists witness underwater volcanic eruption for the first time. There was some audio, but there was also a lot of visual content. So what, how does somebody access that? If they can't see it, they're watching the video, they want to know more about what scientists experienced. And if that's not described within the audio track, then the solution is, it's called audio description, adding a narrative track that describes the content, the visual content of the video. So not all videos need this, but if you are communicating important visual information and that's not accessible, if you, for example, close your eyes, if you're a sighted person, close your eyes and watch a video, and if you don't understand everything that's going on, if there's some key components of that video that are not accessible to you with your eyes closed, then audio description is the solution for making that video accessible. Also, the player itself has accessibility implications. We've talked a lot about keyboard accessibility. If you can't access, particularly the play button, but even, and there are lots of controls on this media player that's shown here. This is the YouTube player. We see a play button. We see what looks like a fast forward to end button. There's a volume control. There's the CC button. There's a settings button, a full screen button, and various other buttons. Question is, can we access all those just by using the tab key to get to them? Or do we have to be a mouse user? So that's an important consideration too when you're dealing with videos, making sure that you choose a player that is accessible. And we also are talking about accessible vendor products. And we've talked about that a lot today as we've talked about procurement in multiple sessions. And we've talked about Zoom. And Zoom really does provide a good example, I think, because it does some things really well. And that has been an evolution. When we first started using it at the University of Washington, it was not very accessible. And we began, as part of this procurement process, we started collaborating with Zoom, and fortunately they were receptive. So some vendors are more receptive than others, but they were interested to hear what we had to offer and to work with us to try and improve their accessibility. And that has been a really positive relationship that actually still exists. That we continue to have monthly meetings with them, and we've got a dedicated email-based discussion list where we've got a direct connection with their accessibility team, and we can collaborate with them and continue to work on improving their accessibility. And I should say also, I don't know if this has come up or not, but their accessibility team includes three, at last count, I think it's 3 of Hadi's former students. So they work with Hadi, much like Alyssa is working with Hadi now as one of his student employees. And they get engaged in all these vendor collaborations. And then after they graduate, if they're interested in a career in accessibility, then companies know them and are interested in hiring them. This has proven itself true with Zoom 3 times now, 3 of Hadi's students on their accessibility team. And so we've got a good connection there. And some of Hadi's students have gone on to other companies as well. But just to, I don't know that we spent a whole lot of time so far in Zoom, but I just want to kind of highlight a few of the things that that make it accessible, because that provides a good example, I think. We've talked about keyboard accessibility. So why don't we do, just take a quick moment to do a little exercise. How about if everybody raises their hand, but don't touch the mouse? And I'll actually give you the answer, how to do this. It is, and I've got to cheat actually. The keyboard shortcut is Alt-Y. If you're in Windows, Y stands for Yo. That's Dan Comden's mnemonic for remembering that. If you're on a Mac, then it's Option Y. So same letter, but different modifier key. So as a presenter, I don't necessarily see, don't see a count to how many hands are up, but I do see a lot of hands are up. So it seems like many of you are able to do that. That is a toggle, so you can Alt-Y or Command Y or Option Y to undo it as well, to lower your hand, raise your hand, or lower your hand. So there actually are keyboard shortcuts for many things within Zoom. And again, Dan has come up with some mnemonics for remembering many of the most frequently used ones. Alt A is for audio. That's for muting. You can mute or unmute. Don't everybody unmute right now. That would be disruptive. Same with video. Alt V for video, but don't do that. Alt H for holler. Again, Dan's mnemonic, but that is for chat. Alt H toggles the chat on and off. And Alt U for users toggles the participants panel on and off. And on a Mac, it's a little bit not so easy. The Windows shortcuts are all Alt and a letter. On a Mac, you sometimes have Command Shift in that same letter. Sometimes it's Option in the letter. Sometimes it's something else in the letter. So it takes a little bit more effort to memorize keystrokes if you're a Mac user. But I think with Windows, it's pretty straightforward. But it's important to point out that keyboard shortcuts is not the only way of making a product accessible. And we encountered this frequently. We could get Hadi talking for hours about this probably, but a lot of vendors that we talk to have lots and lots of keyboard shortcuts that they have thrown at a product. And you can do everything with a keyboard that you can do with a mouse. All you have to do is memorize these 200 keyboard shortcuts. And in some cases, it's a combination of keyboard shortcuts. Like you have to do Alt Control F followed by Shift Alt something else in order to get a function to work. And the more you think about all the keyboard shortcuts that an assistive technology user has to memorize anyway, they've got to learn all their assistive technologies keyboard shortcuts. For screen readers, that in itself is that's a lot of keyboard shortcuts. But they're trying to access the browser, and the browser has a bunch of keyboard shortcuts, and the operating system has a bunch of keyboard shortcuts, and any software applications that they're using, like Microsoft Word or Office or what have you, they all have keyboard shortcuts. And now if you're asking somebody to memorize a bunch of keyboard shortcuts for your website or your web application, it's a pretty tall ask. So that can't be the only solution. And I think Zoom has done pretty good at this. They do have keyboard shortcuts for many, but that's not the only way you can get around. You can also tab and access almost anything. There are a few things that are outlying, not accessible, that I think Zoom knows about most of those. But as you can explore with tab, and you should be able to access almost everything. And there is good visible focus, so you know where you are. There's a blue rectangle that follows you as you navigate through the system. There's still 8 participants with hands raised, so practice lowering your hands if your hand is up, just so I know you don't have a question. About some other things in Zoom. All of these buttons, not only can you tab to them, but they have labels associated with them. So for a screen reader user, they are verbalized. So as you navigate with the screen reader, you've got access to all the buttons and the controls, and you know what they do. Also, captions, we've got flexibility in the captioning. Zoom, of course, introduced just over the pandemic, they rolled out live auto captions. And so you've got machines doing the captioning. And fortunately, even prior to that, long prior to that, they supported human captions. So they had ways for assigning somebody to do the captioning, which is how we're operating in our session today. But occasionally, you've got a need where there's nobody present to do the captioning, and you need to caption, a meeting or what have you, or somebody who maybe doesn't have an accommodation request for captioning, but they just benefit from it. They are able to follow along better if they can see the captions. And so machine generated captions do fill a need. they can fill that void and provide captions in an environment where captions aren't otherwise available. So, so captions are a good thing. The what we're doing today with sign language interpreters, the fact that we have an interpreter or a couple of interpreters who are pinned or highlighted, and the speaker can also be highlighted at the same time. That's a relatively new development within Zoom. This was one of the problems. They initially fixed a lot of the issues with keyboard accessibility and screen reader accessibility, but there were still problems for people who needed sign language interpreting and couldn't pin more than one window at a time. And so you could pin the interpreter, but then they or highlight the interpreter, but then the speaker is not highlighted, and therefore all they get is the interpreter. And so that wasn't ideal at all. And this has been through the pandemic. I think last year they rolled out some significant improvements in their support for things like pinning and highlighting multiple video windows and being able to reposition windows around. So you've got maybe both the interpreters positioned exactly where you need them. So that's a good thing. Also, in the panel over lunch, Jeannie mentioned a couple times that Zoom is easy for her to use. So that in itself is an accessibility issue. That in accessibility, essentially, we are talking about accessibility, like the ability of everyone to be able to access a product. And complexity of a product, difficulty for somebody to understand how to use it is actually an accessibility issue. That actually is one of the one of the WCAG guidelines is understandable, that applications need to be understandable. People should be able to use them without needing to be a rocket scientist or without needing to read the manual in order to figure out how to use it. It should be intuitive enough that somebody can just jump right in and be able to perform key functions. Also, it's highly customizable. So if you haven't already experienced this, somewhere, depending on whether you're using Windows or Mac, you can get to the Zoom preferences dialog. I think probably for everyone, if you click the closed caption button or the live caption button, whatever it's labeled, then there's an option there for subtitle preferences, which brings up a dialog that allows you to do things like change the font size, as well as various other things. There are lots of features that are customizable within the preferences window. Another feature that's in there is what do you want to have verbalized as a screen reader user? Because if everything is fully accessible, every time somebody enters the meeting or exits the meeting or posts a chat, that can get really noisy. And pretty quickly, overwhelm a user. So maybe a user wants all that, maybe they don't. That's all customizable within the preferences screen. So I spent a lot of time here on Zoom just to kind of give you an example of an application that has evolved into one that is really considering the full breadth of users and is doing a good job of trying to make its application accessible to everybody. And we certainly do appreciate that, given how much we have depended on this during the pandemic. If we didn't have an accessible tool to use for all of the online meetings that we have been engaged in over the last year and a half, then this would have been an even bigger disaster than it was. And so Zoom step into the plate and making their product accessible, has really been positive. And this is how accessible the universe could be. If we can get more vendors to do this, and if we oops, I think I lost my camera. But hopefully I'm okay otherwise. Let me just get back on screen here. All right. So shout if there are any technical problems that I'm not aware of. I think I'm good. Anyway, and think about this in the websites, the web applications build or that you purchase and provide to users, just think about this, the full breadth of users and how they can and should be able to engage with your product or your services. So with all that, with that example, I want to revisit WCAG. So we talked about this morning, but WCAG 2.1, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, is the international web accessibility standard. So this was published by the W3C. It's been around since the 90s. Version 1 was published in the 90s. Now we're up to version 2.1. And within WCAG, there are guidelines, and there are principles. There are 4 principles which spell out the acronym POUR. Web content should be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. But within that, there are guidelines within each of those, and within each of those guidelines, there are success criteria. And so success criteria, there are 78 of those. Each is assigned a level A, level 2A, level 3A, level A being the most critical, level 3A being either the least critical or the most difficult. And we are striving to meet level A and level 2A because that's what has emerged through many years of legal resolutions and settlements and policy. Level 2A is reasonable, and that's our expectation. So it's not just about the web. The W in Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is obviously web, but if you look at the individual success criteria, they are all about how we interact with digital information. And if a technology has a user interface, even if it's not on the web, if it is, for example, an information kiosk with a touch screen, then a lot of the principles of WCAG apply to that. And digital documents, WCAG applies. Videos, WCAG applies. The principles are all there within WCAG for anything that has a user interface. Now, the W3C actually has a lot of detail in a W3C note or publication called the WCAG 2 ICT. This actually, if you have the actual slide deck, this is a link which will take you to that document, or you can Google it. WCAG 2 ICT is the W3C's mapping of all of the WCAG 2.0 success criteria to other non-web information and communication technologies. So they have specifically gone through and described how each one of these success criteria maps to different technologies. So that can be a really useful resource if you're trying to make the case for accessibility, as you're negotiating with a vendor of a kiosk, for example. So a few examples of some success criteria that apply to different technologies. For websites, 1.1.1, non-text content. This is a level A success criteria. We need alt text on images is essentially what this one is about. Otherwise, somebody who can't see the image doesn't have any access to the communication that image is offering. Info and relationships, we need structure, as we saw with that document, with that syllabus example. We need headings and lists and column headers within our tables and labels on our forms. That's all part of 1.3.1, which is a level A, again, a top priority issue. Color contrast needs to be sufficient, and there is a specific ratio that needs to be met. 4.5 to 1, foreground versus background is the ratio, unless the text is large. If text is large and there's a specific definition for that within WCAG, then it's not quite so strict. It can be a little bit less contrast, 3 to 1, as opposed to 4.5 to 1, if it's large text, but otherwise 4.5 to 1 is what we're striving for. And there are tools that have lots of free tools that are available to help us measure that. So we don't have to guess, we can see whether the colors that we've chosen meet contrast requirements. Needs to be keyboard accessible. So again, just using the tab key to move around is key. Name, role, and value. Proper use of ARIA. We talked about that this morning, but making sure that well, like the search button, the menu button, those are going to need ARIA behind the scenes, telling assistive technology users what happens when you expand content that wasn't visible before. There's markup within the ARIA that allows that to be exposed to assistive technologies. And it's really important then that that be present. So those are just a few examples. We'll look at a lot more as we start looking at websites. But documents, again, some of the same issues are issues with digital documents, non-text content, info and relationships, contrast. There are many of the same issues for web and documents. Also, I added, just to give you a sense of what's in level 3A, because we so frequently talk about A and 2A success criteria. 3.1.5 speaks to reading level. And this is when text requires reading ability above lower secondary education level, you need to provide an alternative version. So this actually, if you think about this, as you're writing content for your website, and I think particularly I encourage the city and the county to think about this, because your users have a wide variety of reading levels, and so providing information, communicating information in ways that everybody can understand, or that most people can understand, is really critical. And there are ways of measuring this too. Tools that have been developed to measure reading level of content. A really good example, actually, of this in practice, of this success criterion in practice, is Lainey Feingold's. She's an attorney, a civil rights attorney that focuses on disability law. Her website, which is lflegal.com, she has a really good practice of describing every one of her blog posts in a way that is easy to read. So she'll have a more in-depth, kind of a deep dive into the law and into technology in an article, but then at the top of every article, she has a summary that is in simpler language. And so really good practice. And I think it just makes for a better website all around. So I encourage you to check that out as an example. Videos, several success criteria that apply to videos. I've listed a few here. Captions on pre-recorded video required at level A. Captions on live events are required at level 2A. And since we need to meet both A and 2A, both of those apply. Audio description, as I mentioned, that's for people who can't see the video. On pre-recorded video, that's a level 2A requirement. When we look at 3A, sign language is required on pre-recorded video. So not just having captions, but because some people who are deaf or hard of hearing are not native, English is not their native first language. And so sign language may be their first language, and therefore offering sign language interpretation of that video makes the video more accessible than just providing captions. And so that is required at level 3A, but due to the difficulty of having a signer for every one of your videos, that it fell in at level 3A, not at level 2A. So I've got a slide here on the product development life cycle. Mainly the point I want to make with this is that if you look at the product life cycle on the left, where you get design or requirement, actually start with a requirement analysis. What is it that we're going to do here? What are the requirements? Move into design, move into implementation, move into testing, and then after testing, move into evolution, and we release the product. We discover that it has bugs or it evolves in other ways. We add features, and then we repeat the cycle. If we wait to test accessibility in that testing phase after we've already done all the other stuff, or worse yet, wait until evolution, release the inaccessible product, and then start thinking about accessibility, obviously it's too late. And the further along in the cycle we are when we start to consider accessibility, probably it's too late. Testing is too late because we're going to have to go back often to the design phase or maybe even the requirement analysis phase to fix things that are inaccessible. So accessibility really needs to be built in at the beginning. So there's also a digital document life cycle that has a similar sort of set of stages. Same thing applies there. That accessibility needs to be a consideration very early on as you're designing and developing or authoring things in order to ensure that it gets built in from the ground up. Testing with accessibility checkers. Um, there are a number of accessibility checkers. I've listed them here, and we'll use some probably in some of our web accessibility sessions, and so you get a sense for that. But the most important thing on this slide is the link at the bottom, uw.edu/accessibility/tools, lists and provides links to many of these tools and more with some annotations describing what we do with them and why we like them. Also, this isn't just about the web. There are accessibility checkers in Microsoft Office and Adobe Acrobat. Gaby's going to be talking about those tomorrow. There's also a tool that we developed called YouTube Caption Auditor. It's free, open source, available on GitHub. That is designed to help prioritize video captioning efforts on YouTube. So it gives you lots of information about your videos on YouTube. If you have a YouTube channel, and including how many of those are captioned, and then you can sort different ways and focus your captioning efforts on the highest priority videos using that tool. So I've got here a picture of, this is an illustration of an ancient Indian parable of blind men and an elephant. And the story goes something like, there were a group of blind men. They came across an elephant for the first time, and they're trying to figure out what this thing is. And one of them touches the trunk, and he says, "Oh, this is a snake." And the other one touches the tail, and he says, "No, no, it's a rope." And another one touches a leg, and he says, "No, no, it's a tree." So the idea here is that they all are getting different perspectives, but when putting their ideas together, eventually they'll figure out that this is an elephant. The same is true with accessibility checkers, that they all give you slightly different results. And sometimes people will say, well, which one of these is accurate? Because they're all telling me different things. And the answer is they all are offering a different perspective. And I encourage people to use as many accessibility checkers as you can get your hands on in order to get a really wide-ranging understanding of accessibility issues that might be impacting your product or service, and then try to fix them all. So highly encourage people to do that. So more information, we've shared our URL many times throughout the day, but one more time, never hurts, uw.edu/accessibility. The screenshot is of our forthcoming redesign website, but that's still a couple months away probably. But there's still a lot of information on our existing site about all the things that we're talking about here today. So I know I'm at the top of the hour, but I did start late. So with Hadi's permission, I'll go a little long and answer a few questions.
Oh, sure. Feel free. Do it, please. Yeah.
Yeah, anybody's been following chat? Could somebody give me a heads up on what the sort of the top questions are? Or if
there was
in chat.
There was a question, Terrell, about accessibility for social media. Just best practices in general.
Yeah, that's a good question. And every social media platform differs in its support for accessibility. We have some information at uw.edu/accessibility/social that provides, mostly we're linking out because it changes all the time. And so rather than try to keep up with that, we just link out to you have Facebook accessibility, Twitter accessibility. For the most part, they support adding alt text on images or adding caption to videos, but not much more than that. And we are at their mercy to develop an accessible platform. There have been many cases of Office for Civil Rights complaints against higher education institutions. So this is what we pay attention to, as I'm not sure beyond that. But in higher education, many complaints against higher education institutions have included social media usage. And here in Washington, I know that that was true of Western Washington University and of Gonzaga. They both were called out for having inaccessible social media presences. And in investigating that a little bit, I found that what the Office for Civil Rights expected of them was not to not use Facebook, but to use the accessibility features of Facebook. So if they're going to post to social media, add alt text to images, add captions to videos is the bottom line. I see there's also a question, how do I lower my hand? So that is Alt-Y if you're on Windows, or Option-Y if you are on a Mac. Any other questions? If not, over to you, Hadi, to let us know what happens next.
No, that is, thank you very much, Terrell, for giving that fundamental, I would say, knowledge of accessibility, because this is really essential information for the subsequent sessions that we will have. Makes life a lot easier when we get to a more live demo and then exploring the accessibility of the website. So we will be highlighting some of the many points that Terrell has shared with you. But for that, I guess you need a kind of break. It will be a 1 hour and 45-minute sessions. Please take your break and then have your coffee at your desk or wherever you are at, and then take notes as needed, and then see you then in 12 minutes. Thanks again.